So this message is part of a series where we are talking about the vision of our church. Bethel was started in 1979 and has been going. We've had a lot of great things that have happened in our church, and particularly, really, it happened when I came here. It was a sense, even in the sort of interview process when I was being hired to be the pastor, it was talked about that it's time for us to rethink about our vision for the next sort of era of Bethel's ministry. So that was 2019, and as we were getting ready to start doing this visioning stuff, then COVID hit and made all kinds of changes. And so in the aftermath of that, then we are now in this place of saying, okay, God, where are you calling us? Where do you want to bring us, lead us as a church to minister here? And one of the really important questions then, I've emphasized this in the past, that the mission of the church does not change. We are called to make disciples. Jesus gave us that commission throughout time, throughout countries, nations, throughout whatever's happening in the culture. That mission doesn't change. The message doesn't change. Our methods do. Our methods must adapt to and be wise in applying to the culture around us, the situation around us. And so we want to talk today about that in particular. And so I'm going to show you some charts. This is the reality that we face today in terms of the changing landscape of American life, the changing landscape of the church in America today. And I hope this is sobering but not depressing, okay? So this first chart shows, this is the whole history of Gallup polling. They started in the 30s, and they started tracking, among other things, they tracked church membership. And so church membership in the U.S. held steady basically that whole time until about 1999. Some blips in the 70s and 80s, and then after around 2000, it began to drop. It is now below 50%. I got a few more things to share. So one of the questions that people might have is like, is it that people have stopped believing in God? And yes and no. This chart shows this is also from Gallup research. People's, again, these are surveys that people are just answering, their opinion in that moment. This is about whether you believe in God, whether you believe there's a higher power. And again, it's maybe a little bit hard to read, but the blue bar is in the 60s and 70s. I'm sorry, 50s and 60s. See, it's hard to read. You're doing better than me. But that was, can you see that? It's almost 100% of Americans believed in God. And then 2011, you see how it dropped. It dropped again in some of the later years. And then 2022, it dropped again. So we're seeing somewhat of a drop, but still 80% of Americans believe in God. This one's a little weird. Just this is church attendance, again from Gallup polls, and then the Pew Research Center does a lot of research about religious issues in the U.S. So the lower blue, that shows people who say they attend church once a month or so, okay? The upper one that's on its way down, that's the percentage of Americans who say that they worship every week at church. So that has dropped from the year 2000, that's dropped to about 20%. And then the yellow one is the people who say they never attend church, okay? So you got that group of people. It's now I'm having a hard time reading it myself. Is that 40%? 30 some percent say they never attend church. And the other two, if you add those, that just adds up to 30 some percent. So there's another percent of people who say they might go a couple times a year. Okay? So there's another, let's say 30% or so, who say they might go once a year. But between the people who worship weekly and people who worship, at least once a month, that number is now 30, 30, 30 some percent, 31%, 32% of Americans, down from what it was before. And this one shows people's sense of what they would identify themselves as, okay? And it shows the change of that since the year 2000. Or is it? Oh, you guys, I'm having such a hard time reading that. What's the year at the beginning? 72. Okay, you're right. Yeah. Again, in the 70s, up until about 2000, it was steady at about, was that 90% of Americans identifying as Christian. And then the number started to drop. And then it's dropped precipitously after the year 2000. And the reason for the two different, there's a dark line and then some like circles there, that's the overlap of the general social survey, which is surveys that are used by government for social policies, and then the lighter color ones are the Pew Research Center's research, and you can see that they very closely match. So that's people who identify as Christian. The chart on the very bottom that's more or less steady, that's people who identify with some religion other than Christianity in America. Muslim, Hindu, whatever, okay? And then the one that's going up is those who identify with no religion at all. That is what you might have heard people refer to as the nones, people who categorize themselves as with religious affiliation, none. So once again, that's what you see, we'll just call it the decline of people's commitment to Christianity here, and the growth of people who basically dissociate with a religious, any kind of affiliation. Then this final one, I think, is even, it's probably the most sobering of the statistics that I've shown you, or the charts that I've shown you. This shows people who identify as Christian, okay, and it shows the change, how that's, I'm just going to say it, how it's dropped off a cliff since about the year 2000 in America. And then, so where it ends there, that's 2022, I think. And then it shows some projections. So the most optimistic projection there is the projection of what would happen if, for the next 50 years, nobody ever left the Christian church and nobody ever joined the church. So no switching at all. Just demographic trends, the demographers would say then there'd be about, at 2070, there would be, it's a little bit above 50% would be Christian in America. That's, again, no switching. But then the other lines show what would happen if the current trends continue. And the current trends basically are every generation, there's at least a 10% decline of people who identify as Christian. And so if that were to continue, then, well, whatever, if those things were to continue, and then one would be showing an acceleration of that trend, because we're seeing the trend actually accelerate. So, we could be down there quite a bit. So at some point, the expectation is that Christianity would be the minority religion in the United States. So I do want to point something out. That is a crazy fast decline from 2000 to 2022. It's unprecedented. Um, in Europe, for example, been a great decline. In Australia, there's a great decline, but those were over much longer periods of time. And we'll come back to this, but people are still trying to figure out why. Um, you can go ahead and do some Google searches. As I've been doing studies this week, particularly, um, they're all over the map in terms of explanations for why this is happening. But again, it might be historically, when people look back on this era that we're living in, it's going to be a thing that people like, what happened in America in the early 2000s? So in this light, then, what does that mean for Bethel? Oh, one other thing I want to say. Go back to this. This doesn't account for what if God does some amazing thing in this country? What if there's a revival, right? So this is what demographics will show. But who knows what might happen? There have been periods, not this severe, but there have been periods in the U.S. of decline. And then they've been followed by some kind of the Second Great Awakening was one example, other kind of religion. So this is not set in stone because God is still at work, okay? And then the other thing is, this is what's happening in the culture, and God is still in control no matter what happens in the culture. All right. So in light of that, though, let's talk about then, what does it mean for us as at Bethel Church? In your worship handout, there's a sermon notes page, and we have this sort of paragraph as part of a vision statement, a projected vision statement. So here's what we say. We want to devote ourselves to mission and acknowledge the fact, understand the fact that our culture has shifted, or I'm saying it is shifting. The culture is shifting from Christendom. By the way, Christendom is a term for a society that's essentially Christian, a society that's governed by, and the Christian faith is sort of the central core of it. Christendom started with Constantine when Christianity became an officially recognized religion in the Roman world. It went from being persecuted to acknowledged, and then throughout Western society has often been privileged. It's been sort of the identified religion. So that's Christendom. And then again, demographers, people who study this stuff, are talking about our era today as the end of Christendom in Western society. You see it in Europe, for example, and maybe America, we don't know. Okay, so we're in the process of shifting from that reality to one that's more atheism. And atheism gets a lot of press, but again, if you go back to that one thing that showed, still 80% of Americans believe in God. So atheism is not such a huge thing, but agnosticism, people who are not sure what they believe, don't have a lot of strong feelings about faith at all. And then I'm just going to call it, or we've decided to call it, consumerist idolatry. That we haven't given up religion, but instead of serving God, we're serving our career or fame or money or whatever. So that's this trend we're in. We recognize, therefore, then, that some of the things that might have worked in the past to reach people no longer work. First church I planted was in 1991, right out of seminary, Austin, Texas. What we did is we put out ads in the paper. I think we went door to door. Basically, we just hung up our shingle saying, "Hey, we're a church, and our music isn't bad. The sermons aren't bad. Come to our church." And people came. You just hang up your shingle, and they come because they're all looking for a church. What we're saying here is that doesn't work when you have a lot of people who aren't attending church have specifically decided not to attend church. They're apart from it. Okay, God and the gospel message do not change. Obviously. Doesn't need to be said, but we're saying it. To be clear, the gospel message doesn't change, but we must. We live with continued awareness that our calling, not only to satisfy the needs within our church community, but also seeking and saving those who are lost, those who are outside of it. Now, let me just say, I'm not going to get into this in the message, but I'll just bring it up because it comes to my mind right now. This is off the cuff. This is probably one of the biggest issues at Bethel right now that we, as leaders of the church, elders, deacons, the council, we wrestle with because you guys are here and you have desires and you have needs and you have preferences about what you would like Bethel to be. So we could spend all our time as leaders of the church keeping you happy. It's a terrible way to say it, but that's a mindset that some leaders have. We're just going to focus on keeping the people satisfied who are already here. But what about all those people who aren't here? What about this community around us that we're wanting to reach out to the gospel? And so sometimes, it is just a reality, folks, sometimes what it takes to reach those people outside means doing things that you don't like. You'd prefer it to be the other way or this or that. But if we're going to be faithful to our mission, we need to focus on that. So this is a constant, I don't want to call it a battle, but it's a constant tension that we live with as leaders in the church. And once again, as our culture has become more and more of a mission field, it becomes more and more of a pressing issue for us as church. Again, back in the day, in the early days, what you wanted and what our neighbors wanted was probably pretty much the same thing, you know. But now it's a little different. So how do we deal with that? Okay, some questions that we have to get right. First one, and I've alluded to this, it's almost impossible to get this one right now. Figure out, why is this going on? What's happening? Whose fault is this anyway? Why is it that people are leaving the church so much in America these days? And once again, what I want to just affirm to you and repeat to you, reiterate to you, people don't know. There's a lot of opinions. It's probably a combination of factors, demographic factors, things that have happened, our culture, the internet, social media, all kinds of things. It would be helpful for us, it's helpful for us to sort out or to make a distinction between, there's a lot of things that are happening or that have happened out in the world that you and I can't control. But there are some things that we maybe can control. And again, I don't know how much I'm going to get into this. We'll get into this some, but there's some measure of responsibility that we have as Christians today about the fact that so many people have left the church. There are people who've left the church because the church has been unhealthy, because the church people have done this or said that. There's things that we have done as Christians in the Christian church that have made our mission harder. And that's what we want to focus on. Something what we can do something about. So in that regard, I think this is one of the most important questions for the Christian church in America. Are we fighting a culture war? Or are we facing a mission field? And of course you're going to say, well, both. It's both. But here's the thing. You can't do both. You have to make a choice. Because, think about this, if you're fighting a war, if we're fighting a war for the soul of this nation, and those people outside We're fighting against them. What does that make them? That makes them our enemies. And we all know that when you fight a war, you do things that are not nice in order to win. That's how you win. You win a war by destroying your enemies. So I believe, I talked about this a couple weeks ago, that that our churches, we want to be very wise and discerning about how we relate to the political environment in our country. And I'm just going to acknowledge that the way that the political battles are fought, they are battles. They are war. And in the political arena, you do what you need to do to fight and get your position heard. And some of us might be called to serve in that capacity, to be a cultural warrior, to be an activist and protest and whatever. But for a lot of us, if that's not our calling, we want to be really, really careful. Because who is the person that is in my neighborhood who doesn't go to church? Is that an enemy that I need to defeat? Or is that a lost person that I want to win and bring into the fold? And the way that I relate, the way that I interact on social media, the way that I pray, the way that I think, all of that changes. How about this one? Do we think and relate to the world around us more like Jesus or more like Pharisees? All right. I hope you understand when I share some of these things that are maybe more difficult for us to talk about in a church environment. I'm doing it out of love. And these are things that I'm working on myself. These are not things that are comfortable for us to talk about. But we do need to talk. It would be a lot easier for me to get up here and talk about how terrible the world is, and we need to bind together, and we're right and they're wrong. But okay, I'm just going to read this. This is a letter to the editor in the Star Tribune a few years ago. A person writes this to the editor: "When I read letters sent in by Bible-thumping Christians telling us how sinful we are and how right they are, how God is on their side and not ours, how God hates gays, liberals, and other people, I close my eyes for a moment and I say a quiet prayer. I thank thee, O Lord, that I am not and never will be a Christian." Isn't that sad? That's a perspective that this person has, because what they have seen is they have seen Christians in their desire to defend righteousness. They have done that in a way that is not Christ-like. So a pastor in Minneapolis, Greg Boyd, writes this, and this will be an extended quote, but I wanted to share it with you. "There are thankfully marvelous exceptions, but far too often the demeanor of Christians is justifiable cause for unbelief. Just recently, a young man responded to my invitation to faith by telling me, 'I admit I feel a need for a Savior, but honestly, I just can't stand Christians.' While he has perhaps not had a well-rounded exposure to Christians, I completely understand where this young man was coming from. Indeed, I've spent much of my professional life answering objections to the Christian faith from skeptics, and in all the scholarly tomes I've studied, I've never found an argument against the Christian faith nearly as compelling as this one. What makes this situation positively catastrophic is that, according to the New Testament, the church, the community of those who follow Jesus, is supposed to be the main argument for the truth that Jesus is Lord. By God's design, the radical love of those who follow Christ is supposed to convince the world that Jesus is for real. And we're going to look at one of those passages in a little bit later. Instead, the church has become the main argument for convincing people that he's not for real. I can't imagine a greater crisis the church could possibly face than this. How did this happen? To ask the question more pointedly, how is it that Jesus was a magnet for prostitutes and tax collectors, the two most despised classes of sinners in Jesus' day, while the church repels those types of people just as the Pharisees did? The answer, I submit, is as inescapable as it is challenging. The church as a whole is simply more like the Pharisees than it is like Jesus. Now, I have a reason why this is the case. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But, I mean, that's harsh. But George Barna, in fact, it's the guy who's the president now. George Barna is no longer the president of the Barna Research Group. It's someone else. He and a friend of his, one of the other people in the organization, wanted to test this theory or figure this out. Are Christians more like Pharisees than Jesus? And so they created a research tool, and you can Google this if you want tonight. Don't Google it now, but you can look it up later. They came up with a survey that they created that measured people's attitudes towards, this is for Christians, they measured people's attitudes towards people outside of the church, and they measured people's behaviors towards people outside of the church, okay? And then what they did is they put them in terms of yes or no questions. I feel this way, I think this way, I relate this way. And so then they had some questions that would be the kind of things that Jesus would do, the kinds of behaviors Jesus would do, the kinds of attitudes Jesus would have, versus the kinds of things that the Pharisees would do, the attitudes the Pharisees had, okay? So here's what they found. In their research, they found that 70% of the Christians displayed attitudes and behaviors that were more like Pharisees, and 30% of the Christians displayed attitudes and behaviors that were more like Jesus. And again, yes, that's harsh. That's bad news. And I believe I understand why. And I'm going to share that with you in a little bit. So, final question we have to get right is, what year is it? What year are we doing ministry? And it is no longer 1992. It is 2023, and our world has changed. So this must then inform how we go about doing our work as a church. So I thought about what would be scriptural teaching. I'm kind of honing in on what it is we can control when the environment around us, there's so many influences that are pulling people away from Christ. What we can control? And it does seem to me that this issue that I pointed out about are we relating to people, to each other, with love in the way that Christ called us to, or are we not? And if we are not, then it's going to inhibit our mission, and it's probably just contributing to people leaving church. All right? So in light of that, then let's look at this passage from 1 Corinthians 13. And again, if you remember, think about the fact Paul is writing this to a church, and here's what he says. Verse 1, I'm going to read it. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but I have not love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. And in the context of this chapter, he's been talking about various spiritual gifts and some of the questions and controversy in the church about which gifts are more important, and they really valued speaking in tongues as a manifestation, as a demonstration of being a genuine Christian. And so Paul says, if I speak in tongues of men, if I speak in great language that we can understand, and if I speak in spiritual tongues but have not love, it's just going to be annoying. And you've maybe heard that saying. I don't remember who came up with it originally. People would respond and say, who you are communicates so or speaks so loudly that I can't hear what you say. Let me say that again. Who you are speaks so loudly that I cannot listen to what you say. Another, I think, I forget who said, challenged people, preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words. The idea being that we preach the gospel by how we live, by how we relate, by how we love. And so Paul is saying, I can have whatever words I want to share. If there's not love, then what I say is just going to be annoying. Number 2, verse 2. If I have the gift of prophecy, can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains but have not love, I am nothing. And so, great spiritual zeal, great knowledge. Again, if you think about it, this is what we value the most. It's like as a church, we want to have real spiritual zeal. We want to have great doctrinal knowledge. And Paul says, if I have all of that but don't have love, it's meaningless. Then, verse 3, if I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, but have not love, I gain nothing. So I can go all out with my dedication. I can work super, super hard. And still, without love, it means nothing. It will gain nothing. So then he goes on in verses 4 to 7 to describe, to talk about in various ways what love looks like. And I don't need to go into that. And I'm putting it this way, that we know what love looks like. We instinctively can tell if a person is relating to us in love or not. I mean, what Paul talks about there, we see that, we experience that, we see its opposite, we experience its opposite, and we know. And so does everybody else. John 13, Jesus said, I'm giving you a new command. Love each other. Love one another. Just as I have loved you, you should love one another. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you're my disciples. And unfortunately, the flip side of that also sometimes happens, right? So this is why we're more like Pharisees than Jesus, I think. This is why we have such a hard time. Because we're afraid. It's because of fear. The reason we're so bad at love in the church today is because we are running on the fuel of fear, and we are pumped this fuel of fear by practically every media source we have, Christian and otherwise. If I run a Christian organization that's dependent on your giving, and I send out fundraising letters, I'm going to get you as scared as I can to show you how serious things are so that you'll give money to me, right? Uh, so all around us, we are the flames of fear are being stoked by everybody. It's terrible out there. This country's going to hell. People, this and that. They're coming after our kids. All kinds of stuff. And I'm not saying that we should not be aware of what's happening. I'm not saying we should be having our heads in the sand. But I'm saying we need to recognize that we are serving the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And we need to recognize that even if the church of this country goes and becomes just 2% of the population, Christ is still the Lord. We will still grow in our faith. We will grow and we will walk with Him. And that's God's responsibility. That's God's deal. He will take care of it. Because listen to this, 1 John 4. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. In this case, this is fear in the relationship between us and God. If our relationship between us and God is focused on fear, we're just going to relate to God in a way that will hopefully keep Him from punishing us. And that's not love. That's just relating in fear. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. So we have very clear ideas about and commitments to righteousness. We have desires for righteous living in our country. We have desires for how things play out in this community. And then we see things going the wrong direction. And it bothers us. And it's hard to demonstrate love to someone when the focus of the focus that you have is fear. You're afraid of what they might do. You're afraid of how they might pull you away. You're afraid of I don't know what might happen if you relate to them honestly and in love. What if we just said, God, you are going to take care of the future of our society. We're just going to love the people around us. And there's going to be people that will come to us and they have a lifestyle that we disagree with. And they're doing things that we think are wrong, but we're going to love them. And when the occasion comes up, we can talk about it, we will. But the most important thing is that they're going to know that we love them. What if we had that sort of mindset, and then let whatever fear of, oh boy, does that mean this might happen, or I need to say that, don't I? Just let all that go and just relate in love and see what happens. So, what happens when we wake up kind of like, is it Rip Van Winkle, fell asleep and wake up and the world has changed? Seems like that's what's happening right now. And there's a lot more that I could say about this, that we could say, we could talk together, we could agree on some things, disagree about some things. But can we agree on this, that it is especially important as our world is shifting, that we get right in our minds, or get right in our way as Christians, is that no matter what, we're going to be people who are known for love. And to do that, then we have to let go of some other fears. But we want to be Christians that relate in love.